Legends Universe podcast. This podcast is for creative listeners and readers who love being immersed in new worlds filled with heroes worth cheering for. I'm your host, author Joe Field, and before we continue with the Slug, let's listen in on what's happened so far. Did you get any good shots? I got a few decent ones, but this one's my favorite. It showed the Slug flying with the goober stretched over his head about to smack cue ball. The Slug didn't respond right away. He was thinking about the picture running in newspapers across the world. What will happen when the cartel catches wind of it? That means you're up against Cutter from 4. You ready? I never imagined fighting for a country like Finnska, but if it means I can take down people like Cue Ball and Cutter, I'm all in. Most of the packed arena cheered for him as they waved bandanas in the air, some of them purple in color. The Slug had seen Cutter use the hammer and remembered he could drive an entire spike into a plank with one swing. I'm not just gonna hurt you, I'm gonna make an example of you. So Sledge and the rest of Finnska knows I'll rule with authority after I win this tournament. Cutter was straddling the Slug with his body, pushing his weight down in his stomach. The Slug ducked and plunged the tip of the chair into Cutter's chin. I'm gonna kill you! The head of the hammer struck his ribs and he felt several of them crack. Before Cutter could move, the Slug jumped on his back and wrapped his bicep around Cutter's neck. Cutter strained against the Slug's grip one last time, then tapped the Slug on his arm 3 times. Out of the shadows and into the arena, the Slug is back. Alright folks, get ready. The Season 1 finale is about to begin right now. Quadrant 3 in Finnska. The door of his bedroom burst open and the Slug felt a thunderbolt of pain when he tried to sit up in his bed. Stay down, relax. Matt closed the door behind him. The Slug sunk back into the fetal position. One of his arms clutched his ribs like a brace. Mac looked around the room. Cozy little room you have here. Sometimes it reminds me of the slums back in Mexico, said the Slug. Not in terms of the smell or furniture, but just the tiny nature of the room. The Slug winced when another shot of pain went through him. How bad is it? Mac sat on the edge of the table in his room, his legs dangling. Did you break some ribs? The Slug dragged away his hand and looked down at his ribs. There was a purple and black bruise that stretched from his armpit down to his waist. Definitely broken. Once my adrenaline wore off from the match, it got more painful by the minute. Now it hurts when I move and breathe in too quickly. I can't imagine what would happen if I laughed or sneezed. He shot his eyes up at Mac. So please don't tell me any jokes. Mac gave him a casual smile. Looks like the citizens of Finnska are liking you. I saw a lot of purple around the arena today and more cheers than booze for you this time. The Slug looked down at the purple outfit he was still wearing. The sweat from the match had finally dried and now his whole body felt sticky. His ribs hurt too much to think about showering. That was pretty cool to see, I have to admit. The Slug looked up at the windowsill and saw the empty Coke bottles. Shoot, can I get you something to drink? I might have a Coke around here somewhere. Don't worry about me. Mac pulled something out of his pocket and extended it toward him. Want a piece of Pez candy? Mac had a Mickey Mouse Pez dispenser. He pulled back on Mickey's head and a piece of candy popped out. No thanks, unless you plan to toss it directly in my mouth. Mac laughed. For you, I would. He put a candy in his own mouth and slid the dispenser back in his pocket. I'm not sure if you heard, but Ruxton lost to Sledge. Mac shook his head. I just can't stand Sledge, and I know this country will fall right back into its old ways if he wins the tournament. You think you'll be able to fight tomorrow? The Slug hung his head and sighed. Right now, I don't even think I'll be able to get out of bed in the morning. I may be able to get something for you. Mac rubbed his chin. There's this sports doctor back in Arrowhead who used to give us injections of lidocaine before our NSL games. He didn't do it a lot, but when one of us was hurt really bad, it helped numb the pain for the game. It won't prevent you from further damaging your ribs in a match against Sledge, but it would eliminate the pain you're feeling right now. I'll try anything at this point. The Slug rested his hand on his ribs. And I really want to fight Sledge tomorrow because His voice trailed off. What? I don't know. The Slug paused. When I first came to Finnska, I sort of wrote the country off. I viewed it as a good place to hide out and bide my time. I'm thinking differently about it now. Not everyone here is a big jerk like Cue Ball and Cutter. There are some good people like Huey, Tucker, and even Chip seems nice despite being a reporter. I feel the same way. Mac reached his hand inside his leather jacket. That reminds me. I grabbed a copy of Chip's article for you. Mac pulled out a folded newspaper. He opened it and placed it in front of the Slug on the bed. The headline read, "The Mysterious Luchador of Finnska Nation." Under the headline was the picture Chip had showed them last night on his rooftop. The one of the Slug flying at cue ball with the outstretched goober above his head. The Slug looked up at Mac. Where did this article run? Don't worry, just ran here in Finnska. I mean, sometimes larger news outlets will pick up their stories, but that rarely happens. The Slug scanned the article. Chip used the Slug instead of La Babosa as he had asked. His eyes stopped when he saw Nacho Mama written in the article. He continued reading and saw Chip had told a story about the origins of his knockout phrase. He looked back up at Mac. What is it? Mac asked. I thought it was a pretty good article myself. It does look good, and I'm glad he didn't use La Babosa in it. The Slug handed it back to Mac. But the picture of me and the story about Nacho Mama worries me a bit. Those are two pretty big identifiers. If someone back home catches wind of this article, they'll know it's me right away. Mac took the article back and placed it on the table. You can keep the article, but I need you to level with me. Tell me more about what happened back there so I can make sure I know what we're up against if anyone comes after us. What we're up against? The Slug let his eyes drop to the floor. It's kind of embarrassing, and I would never want to involve you or anyone else here with my issues. It's okay, Max said with a soft voice. Anything you say to me won't leave this room, and rest assured, we are in this thing together now. The Slug took a deep breath in and felt a stab of pain. Back when I was wrestling, I developed a little gambling addiction. It didn't start as an addiction. It was sort of a fun way for me to bet on other AAA matches. Then the addiction grew and I had a series of terrible losses. I kept betting on the favored wrestlers and the underdog kept winning. As I lost more money, I began betting on other things like bullfights, horse races, and cockfights. The Slug looked up at the fan in the corner of his room for a few moments and then continued. I finally lost so much money I couldn't stake my bets. That's when I got in with some bad people who worked for the cartel. They staked me money, and when I couldn't pay them in time, they threatened to kill me. That's when my coach, Onyx Ramirez? That's right. That's when Onyx went to a rival cartel and convinced them to pay off my debt so long as I threw that match to El Lobo. Not only throw it, Max said, but let him demask you. They tried to tell me my moral stance and role could change while my character remained fixed. But to me, my character's role as a good guy became who I was. It was connected hand in hand with La Babosa, the Slug. It would be like your favorite good guy superhero suddenly switching sides. And now, because I didn't do what they wanted me to do, both cartels want me dead. Mac tapped his fingers on the table. That's some heavy stuff right there. I've heard and read things about the cartels over the years, and I know what they're capable of. But if you beat Sledge tomorrow, you'll be given the championship belt and become the new governor of Finnska. That means you'll have security guards, and shoot, I'll also throw in some protection from people like Huey to make sure nothing happens to you. The Slug shook his head. You don't understand. They'll send highly trained sicarios to kill me, and it won't matter what title I have. They'll want to make an example of me. Let me tell you a little secret. Mac lowered his voice. I used to moonlight as an assassin, back when Arrowhead had a terrible leader who was in Shikan's pocket. Really? The Slug let the doubt in his voice come through. Was that what you and Huey were joking about? Something about the Sizzler? Mac nodded his head. That's right. I can think like an assassin because I was one. I can come up with a security plan that will keep you safe and keep those sicarios out. And if it ever comes to it, you can always cool off in Arrowhead. I could show you around the country and introduce you to people as Finnska's newest governor. Shoot, I could do that anyway if you win. Governor. The Slug whispered the word to himself. Until this point, I hadn't really thought about that aspect of this tournament. I was fighting just to get back in the arena, to fight again as the Slug, and to take down some of these thugs. Am I really capable of running an entire country? I don't even have a proper suit. Sure you can. It's actually way easier to be a politician than most people think. You just have to pretend you're really busy all the time and make quick, decisive decisions, even if you have no clue what you're doing. Mac winked at him. I made it through my whole first year as the loot of Arrowhead doing just that. The Slug tried to fight back a laugh but lost and felt a sharp pain inside. Sorry. It's okay, the Slug responded through clenched teeth. What are we even talking about here? I can't even get out of bed right now, let alone go fight someone as capable as this Sledge guy sounds. I think we need to focus on that before we fantasize about governor titles and running countries. You'd be a good one, though. Mac tucked a strand of his blonde hair behind his ear. A good what, governor? That's sort of like filling the role of a Rudo back in Mexico. The last time I tried being a Rudo, I had to leave my country forever. Nah, I'm saying you'd be a good leader, Mac said. Forget about the titles and all that. I've studied Lucha Libre enough to know Rudos represent politicians and narcos. They're the brawlers, always antagonizing the crowd with their strength and size. The Slug nodded his head in agreement. You'd be an outstanding leader because you've always been, and will always be, a technico, the hero. You represent the common man with humble upbringings, known for your technical skills, aerial maneuvers, and likability. Think about these Finnska brutes like Cue Ball, Cutter, and Sledge as Rudos. Mac leaned forward. You're the hero this country needs right now more than ever, and I'll make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. Mac looked down at his ribs, at least outside of the ring. Despite his pain, Mac's words filled the Slug with a sense of peace and reassurance, like some strange sort of intervention. Maybe it was God or his abuela had led him to where he was right now. He looked down at the cross hanging from his neck and then back up at Mac. That's very kind of you, and I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but I've always had this one fantasy. What's that? Have you ever seen those pictures of El Santo wearing his luchador mask with a full-on dress suit with a tie and pocket square and all? Mac's eyes lit up. That was my Halloween costume a few years back. The Slug grinned. I always imagined wearing a suit like that with my mask and having it actually mean something. Not that it doesn't mean something for Halloween, but you know what I'm saying. I know more than anyone else in this part of the world. Mac slid off the table to his feet. This has been a great chat, but I have to go make some calls and make sure we're good to go for tomorrow. He hurried to the door. I just don't know how tomorrow's gonna work with my busted up ribs going against an opponent like Sledge, the Slug called after him. Mac flashed him a smile. Leave the ribs to me and start visualizing your fight against Sledge in the ring. But I know nothing about him. I wasn't even able to watch his matches. A good way to think about Sledge is to imagine combining the best fighting qualities of Cue Ball and Cutter into one fighter, and then picture that fighter being someone bigger, faster, and stronger than both of those guys. Mac pounded his chest. You got this. The Slug's eyes grew wide as Mac described Sledge. He tried to pound his chest in response and was awarded with another shock of pain. Ah! Mac left the room and the Slug curled back into the fetal position. He stared at one of the empty Coke bottles on the windowsill. Yeah, you got this all right. His voice was a whimper. Center City in Finnska. Mac flew his sports doctor over from Arrowhead first thing in the morning and brought him up to the Slug's room. The Slug had slept little because every time he would doze off, he'd put pressure on his ribs and feel the sharp pain again in his side. After the doctor administered the shots of lidocaine in his ribs, the pain subsided and he asked if he could take a quick nap. Mac told him the fight was about to start and he had to get down to the arena immediately. The doctor further emphasized the shot would wear off in 60 to 90 minutes, if not sooner. They rushed over to the arena and the Slug sat on a bench in the back part of the arena's locker room by himself. There was discarded athletic tape scrunched up in balls at the corners of the room. It smelled like urine and body odor. A ceiling fan spinning overhead did little except for push the smell around the room. He could hear the distant roar of the crowd out in the arena. His goober was leaning on the bench next to him. He tapped his knuckles on it for good luck. He looked up at the locker room mirror across the room and saw the whole right side of his stomach was completely black. It was the worst bruise he'd ever had in his life. He grabbed the cross on his necklace and it reminded him of the moments in the locker room leading up to the last match in Mexico. Abuela, he said out loud, if you can tell the big man upstairs to help me through this one, I would really appreciate it. Te quiero. He kissed his cross. The pain in his side was still muted, but he felt a little tingle as he stood up. The locker room door slammed open and Matt came in the room. He heard the noise of the arena. You ready, champ? Let's go before the pain comes back. The Slug grabbed his goober and followed Mac out. You will not believe the crowd. Mac was charging down the hallway. It's incredible. What do you mean? You'll see. Mac stopped and motioned toward the arena's introduction platform. They're about to call your name. I'm gonna head down and take my seat in the front row. Go slay that dragon. Mac extended a fist. Thanks, Mac Attack. The Slug bumped his knuckles and turned away when he heard the announcer introduce Sledge. The crowd let out a mixture of boos and applause. He felt a hand grab his shoulder and turned to see Mac was still there. Mac leaned toward his ear. I almost forgot to mention. Mac had to yell into the Slug's ear even though he was right next to him. I asked around and found out Sledge has only been beaten one time in a Finnska fight. It was early in his career and it was by pin. I guess it's impossible to knock or tap him out, but the pin worked once. Thought you should know. Thanks for the tip, the Slug called out. He walked down the hallway to the introduction platform. There was an arena security official listening to his radio. He waved at the Slug when he spotted him. And the opponent, the announcer called out, perhaps the smallest fighter to ever step into a Finnska ring, a true underdog story from Quadrant 3, the Slug! The Slug was hit by a blast of noise that he had never experienced, not even during the pinnacle of his career back home. The crowd let out an arena-shaking cheer that sent the decibel levels through the roof. He puffed out his chest and marched to the platform. He was met with a sea of purple. Everyone was wearing the color purple and waving purple bandanas above their heads. They stood shoulder to shoulder, ignoring assigned seats. It was standing room only. He saw 4 huge, half-naked men with the letters S-L-U-G painted on their bellies, a letter apiece. As he sauntered down the ramp to the ring, he heard the rattle of a large paper sign. The sign had his Slug emblem on it with the words, "Let's go Slug," beneath it. He blinked his eyes as cameras flashed in his face. He saw Mac and Huey in the front row seats. A boy, who he assumed was Tucker, was scrunched between them wearing a luchador mask. What? How did he get a mask? Mac pointed down at the boy's mask. Then he and Huey pulled their own matching masks out of their jackets. They slipped them over their heads and Mac gave him the Shaka sign. The Slug returned the Shaka sign. He turned his head to see arena attendants using t-shirt guns to launch purple shirts out into the stand. Amazing, he thought. Turning his attention to the ring, he took 2 quick steps and slid onto the ring's mat under the bottom rope. He held his goober out in front of him and then stopped. He craned his neck and looked up. It was the first time he could take in his opponent. His jaw dropped as he stared at the man in the ring across from him. Sledge reminded him of the pictures he used to see of Goliath from children's Bibles. He remembered those pictures always portrayed Goliath as 3 times taller than David, and for once seeing Sledge in person made the Slug think that depiction was accurate. Sledge wasn't just a tall and massive pile of girth. He had clearly defined muscles from his tree trunk of a neck to his biceps, which looked to be as large as wooden barrels. He had a resting snarl on his face, with an ungodly unibrow that made him look like the Philistine giant. Without realizing it, the Slug held his goober in front of his body like it was a shield. Sledge peered down at him, and after a few moments he let out a laugh. He held his stomach as his chuckle turned into a full belly laugh. Sledge closed one of his eyes and held his index finger and thumb up to his face, taking his time to measure him. Then he let out another laugh. If only I had some stones and a slingshot, the Slug thought. All right, weapons in the bins. A referee stepped in and pointed to the corners. Let's go Slug! Let's go Slug! Let's go Slug! Let's go Slug! The Slug looked out at the crowd and raised his goober as he made his way to the corner of the ring. They waved their bandanas even faster and let out a tremendous cheer in response. He looked down and saw a ringside girl carrying the championship belt around the outside of the ring. She raised it over her head, showcasing it to the fans. He slid his goober in his bin and said a quick prayer. He stared down at the mat for a moment, trying to drown out the crowd. Max said Sledge was beaten once by pin. The Slug recalled going against large rudos back in Mexico and stealing wins from them through well-timed pins. Might be my only chance today. He reached for his side as he turned to the center of the ring. He felt a dull tingle as though the pain was coming back. Glancing up, he saw Sledge flip a long piece of lumber in his bin. The lumber looked almost as tall as Sledge. The Slug peered closer. It can't be. That's not a 2x4 stud like I was going to use. That's a 4x4 piece of tree and wood, and it's 8 feet long. Sledge handled it like he was tossing a broom into the closet. The referee came to the center of the ring and extended his arm. The 2 fighters met in the middle. Sledge shook his head and called out to the Slug above the noise with a booming voice. You're crazy to think you could come to my country and beat me. You're right, the Slug screamed. Maybe I am a little loco. Loco? Sledge furrowed his unibrow. Fight! The referee backed away. It means crazy! The Slug shot down low and hit Sledge in the middle of his shin. It felt like hitting a brick. Sledge took 1 step back before he planted his trail foot and tried to stomp on the Slug's back. The Slug shot forward between the giant's legs, avoiding the kick. Now behind Sledge, the Slug spun back and hooked his right arm under Sledge's crotch. He put his foot right between Sledge's ankle and pulled back with all of his strength. Sledge fell backwards onto the mat and the Slug lifted his leg up for a pin. The referee was late getting over. By the time he pounded it once on the mat, Sledge had already thrown the Slug off. Darn it! The Slug glared at the referee. You'll have to do better than that. Sledge came right at him with surprising speed and locked his hands around his head. Before the Slug could break the hold, Sledge lifted him into the air and flipped him back over his shoulders. Sledge held him there by linking his massive arms around the Slug's armpit. The Slug was dangling from the top of Sledge's shoulders with his back to Sledge, his arms straight out and his legs down. He looked out at the crowd. They were watching in disbelief and dismay. He felt the same way. He knew Sledge was setting up for a reverse crucifixion slam. The Slug tried to kick backward at Sledge with his heels but only hit the Giant's buttocks region with little impact. Sledge started walking around the ring with the Slug propped up on his back like the Roman guards lifting the cross Jesus was nailed to. Except the Slug wasn't Jesus, and right now he felt more like a helpless criminal on the crosses next to the Savior. Sledge arched his back and then drove the Slug up and over his head, slamming him down into the center of the mat. The Slug landed awkwardly on the back of his neck. He felt a nerve pinch and his world went dark for a few moments. He tried to get up, but Sledge rolled over on top of him, pinning him to the ground. 1, 2, 3. The referee stopped his count when the Slug mustered enough energy to break free of the pin. He slid backward, looking toward the red light to see if it was spinning, but it was unchanged. He couldn't tell if it was stars he was seeing or flashes of lights from cameras. His neck was throbbing and his ribs were jarred by the impact. It sent shooting pain down his sides.
Guess I'll have to go a little bit higher on the next one.
Sledge moved in on him and grabbed him by the back of the mask. He pushed him into the corner of the ring. The Slug tried to fight back, but Sledge was too big. Sledge lifted him up by the neck and positioned him on the top corner ropes of the ring so he's facing out at the crowd, his legs dangling over the ropes. What is he gonna do to me? The Slug tried to focus despite his foggy head. The crowd was all but silent now, their bandanas down and their faces long. It reminded him of the end of his match against El Lobo back in Mexico. Another arena in a different country and still the same disappointing end to my fighting career. Sledge climbed the ropes. They bent under his weight. He moved up so he was equal with the Slug on the top ropes. The Slug was waiting for him to throw him off the ropes with a match-ending slam. Instead, Sledge wrapped one of his massive hands around the Slug's neck, and with his other one he pulled up on the back of his mask. "No!" Max screamed out from below. "Don't do it!" The Slug tried to reach back and grab Sledge's hand, but Sledge was too strong. Sledge was having trouble with the straps on the mask, and the extra time allowed the Slug to think. He had made his living on the top rope corners back in AAA. That's where he used to perform his signature fall-away moonsault slam, which normally turned into a pinfall. Except he was usually behind his opponent, not in front. That's when he had an idea. He leaned back into Sledge and lifted his legs up so they were on the top padding of the corner of the ring. Sledge was still behind him, but the movement caused him to slip back a bit. It was all the momentum the Slug needed. He found his body's last bit of reserve and he bent down into a squat. He propelled himself up and over Sledge's shoulders, hooking his legs around Sledge's neck. He ripped back as hard as he could and he felt Sledge's body go airborne, up and over him and onto the mat. The Slug completed his own backflip and landed right on Sledge's chest. He felt Sledge's body go limp. The Slug hooked Sledge's leg in the process and pressed his back into the mat, driving his shoulder down as hard as he could with his legs flexed on the mat behind him. The crowd let out an ear-piercing roar. They screamed along as the referee pounded on the mat. 1, 2, 3, winner by pin, the referee called out. The Slug didn't think the crowd could get any louder, but they somehow escalated to a whole new level. People were screaming at the top of their lungs as they stomped their feet in the stands. Fireworks suddenly went off in the arena and were followed by confetti that rained down from the ceiling. The Slug dropped to his knees in the center of the ring and raised his hands up to the heavens. The confetti hit his face and he looked up and smiled. "Thank you, Abuela. Looks like your good word was just the ticket I needed." He had a hard time processing what happened next. His head was still foggy from the match and his body hurt like heck. He later recalled seeing fans pour over the railing and come into the ring. A mob of fans pushed a stunned Sledge out of the ring and lifted the Slug up in the air. They exited the arena with him propped up on their shoulders. They marched directly to the central government building chanting, "Governor Slug! Governor Slug! Governor Slug!" It was the happiest moment of his life. Center City in Finnska. Large floor-to-ceiling windows provided a commanding view of the city from the office of the governor. It had been 2 weeks since the Slug had defeated Sledge in the epic fight at the arena. After the Slug took the oath of office, the citizens of Finnska threw him a wild parade that rivaled a Dia de Muertos processional back in Mexico City. Local artists started painting a giant mural of the Slug on the side of the arena. Street vendors were selling out of Luchador masks faster than they could import them. The Slug rubbed the back of his neck as he watched the sun set over the city, its orange rays extending along the horizon. He was still working out a kink at his neck from the slam Sledge had delivered during the fight. His ribs were feeling a little better, but still reminded him he was human when he moved too quickly. He clipped the championship belt off his stomach and draped it over his executive desk. He sat down in his oversized leather chair. It squeaked when he leaned back. He wondered how Sledge could fit in the chair while he was keeping the office warm for him. The room smelled of fresh leather and was lined with various weapons hanging on the walls. The Slug had hung his goober prominently on the wall across from his desk. He heard footsteps outside his door and stood as it opened. It was Mac, and with him a woman the Slug didn't recognize. El Gubinator! Mac called out as he moved toward his desk. The Slug stepped from behind the desk and met him in the center of the office. Mac, it's great to see you. They shook hands and Mac took a step back to look him over. Wow, you clean up nice, like El Santo Reborn. Looks like a perfect fit, too. A big thanks to you for the gift. The Slug glanced at the mirror on the wall of his office. He was wearing a tailored pinstripe suit with a purple pocket square that matched the color of his mask.
If you weren't already known as the Slug, I think El Gobernador would be a good name for you,
the woman said. Shoot, where are my manners? Mac hurried over to the woman's side. She had attractive features with olive skin and a kind, confident face. She wore a gold-colored outfit with a faded purple cowboy hat. This is my beautiful wife, Mac said. Gabby Oaks, the supreme leader of Arrowhead Nation. The Slug rushed over to shake her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, supreme leader.
Please, call me Gabby.
She shook his hand.
I look forward to working with you to help restore the country of Finnska.
Likewise, the Slug smiled at her. A big thanks goes to your husband, Mac. It was his idea to have me wrestle in this tournament once he figured out who I was. Gabby squeezed Mac's forearm.
That sounds like my husband, all right. He's been obsessed with Lucha Libre for a long time.
What can I say? Mac shrugged. Maybe after I'm done being the Loot, I can put a mask on of my own and see what I can do in the AAA circuit. He pretended to elbow smash the top of the chair. The Slug and Gabby laughed. They looked back at the door when they heard more footsteps. Chip, Tucker, and Huey stopped in the doorway. Hey guys, the Slug waved them in. Come on in. Tucker walked up to the Slug with a Luchador mask and a permanent marker in his hands. Mr. Governor, sir, could you please sign my mask for me? Easy, son. Chip followed close behind. I'm sure the Slug is busy. Not a problem at all. The Slug took the mask and pen and signed his name. He handed it back to Tucker, who had a huge smile spread across his face. The Slug looked up and saw Mac wink at him. Congrats again on the big win, Huey said, reaching out to shake the Slug's hand. I'll never forget that fight with Sledge as long as I live. Thank you very much. I'm still processing it all, said the Slug. We have a lot of work to do to restore our country back to where it once was. I love that you're using we and our when discussing Finnska, Chip said. That means a lot to us and makes me feel even worse for what I'm about to tell you. Everyone turned their heads to look at Chip. He pulled out his phone and held it up. The Slug could see it had words written in Spanish. Sounds like my article about your tournament run got picked up by some news outlets from other parts of the world. The Slug stared at the phone. Which news outlets? Chip cleared his throat. Like, Mexico News Daily. They ran the story, and judging from the comments on their online version, it looks like everyone figured out it was you, La Babosa. The Slug felt his blood pressure spike. He put his arms around his back and moved over to the office windows. He looked out at the sun and watched it retreat beyond the horizon. It's okay, Max said, following him. We'll implement a plan to protect you, starting with having you come back to Arrowhead for a while to lay low. I can be at your side the whole time, Huey said.
Any resources you need will be provided,
Gabby added. The Slug thought about how he had run away from Mexico to Finnska. He'd all but come to terms with Finnska being a transition point in life, a stopover on his way to the next hiding place. When the citizens of Finnska supported him in his match against Sledge, his perspective had changed. This was his new home, and no cartel members or sicarios could change that. He looked up at Mac. I'm done running. I will stay in Finnska, and I'll help every quadrant restore their homes and businesses one board at a time. He paused and looked around the room at the others. And if necessary, I will fight. Thank you for listening to the Legends Universe podcast. I hope you enjoyed the first season of the show. A big thanks to the talented actor Erin Shaughnessy for her Gabby Oaks cameo. Make sure to check out Erin's narration of the Gabby Oaks and Zoe Wynn audiobooks on Audible and explore all the Legends universe has to offer, including ebooks, paperbacks, audiobooks, merch, world maps, and more at legendsuniverse.net. That's legendsuniverse.net. Until next time, this is author Joe Field. Chop suey!